Administration of the Department-Owned Float Standard Specification. By John Santos, Senior Transportation Engineer. Caltrans District 8 Construction. Overview. The Department-Owned Float Specification allows Caltrans to save money when it owes the contractor time-related overhead charges for delays that were caused by Caltrans. The concept is simple. It allows Caltrans to reduce the amount owed to the contractor for state-caused time delays by subtracting the amount of time the department saved for the contractor on other activities. The specification has been part of the standard specifications since the 2010 edition, however, its use is almost unheard of in District 8. This presentation will try to explain how it works in simple terms and describe when it was recently used to save Caltrans $17,000 on a project in 2019. What is the Department-Owned Float Specification? 2022 Standard Specifications. 8-1.02c, 8c, Department-Owned Float. The engineer may accrue Department-Owned Float. The engineer documents Department-Owned Float by ordering you to update the Department-Owned Float activity on the next update schedule. Include a log of the action on the Department-Owned Float activity and include a discussion of the action in the narrative report. The engineer may use Department-Owned Float to mitigate past, present, or future department delays by offsetting a potential time extension for a change order. Prepare a TIA upon request to determine the effect of Department-Owned Float. Department-Owned Float is a resource for the exclusive use of the department. In the mid-2010s, Jonathan Skeeth from the District 8 CPM/Claims Unit briefly described the Department-Owned Float specification in a construction meeting and proclaimed, "No one ever uses this spec," suggesting it would never be used because it was too complicated. He was unaware at the time that it had already been referenced on at least 2 projects. It has been used a third time since then to recoup $17,000 in time-related overhead costs. At the time of preparation for this presentation, these were the only 3 instances that could be found where it was used in District 8. What is float? Definition from the 2022 Standard Specifications. Float, difference between the earliest and latest allowable start or finish times for an activity. Total float, amount of time that an activity or chain of activities can be delayed before extending the scheduled completion date. In a CPM schedule, the float is usually shown in a column, here titled Total Float. It is the maximum number of days an activity can be delayed before it delays the project completion. The activities with the lowest amount of float are what make up the critical path. In this schedule, the activities with 0 total float are highlighted. Because they have 0 float, any of them delayed by 1 day will delay project completion, thus they are critical activities. Critical path activities also show up as red bars in the bar chart schedule as shown here. Example of float. Because they have 0 total float, the bars associated with these submittals are on the critical path, thus they show up red on the schedule. This means that for every day they are delayed, the project will finish 1 day later. What is Department-Owned Float? Definition from the 2022 Standard Specifications. Department-Owned Float, time saved on the critical path by actions of the department. It is the last activity shown on the schedule before the scheduled completion date. Here is an example of Department-Owned Float on a CPM update schedule. Why are we allowed to mitigate department-caused delays with Department-Owned Float? Because theoretically, for instance, if we are allowed a certain number of days for a review that is on the critical path, and we complete the review in less time than allowed, we save the contractor time, which allows him to complete the project earlier. Therefore, if we delayed him on any activity, the amount of time we saved him on a review should make up for the same amount of time we delayed him. How do you accrue Department-Owned Float? First, identify activities that are on the critical path. This can be done by identifying which activities have the least total float. They can also be identified because their bars show up as red on the schedule bar diagram as shown below. Second, determine whether there are submittal review activities on the critical path. In this example, Caltrans review and approve activity for the temporary support submittal is on the critical path. This presents an opportunity for Caltrans to accrue Department-Owned Float in the event that the review is completed in less time than is allowed per the contract. Why? Because since it saves time on the critical path, this allows for the contract work to be completed earlier than the scheduled completion date. Example of float in a baseline schedule. In the above example, activities A1700, A1800, A1900, A2000 all show 0 for total float. This means that for every day they are delayed, the project will complete 1 day later. Activities A1800 and A2000 are also submittals and action items. The contract allows 15 days for Caltrans to review them. The contractor only shows a duration of 10 days. Comments we provided for this baseline submittal required the contractor to correctly set the duration to 15 days per contract, potentially increasing the amount of department-owned float available. It appears that the most recent time the department-owned float specification was used on was in 2019 on Project 08-0P3904 on Highway 18 in the high desert. During construction on that project, a SWPPP review period drove the critical path. Caltrans reviewed the SWPPP submittal twice. The 15-day review period was completed in 7 days and 10 days, saving 13 days total. The contractor was asked to put these days on the schedule as department-owned float per the standard specifications. Here is the email directing the contractor to record the department-owned float in the CPM update. It began, "Please add 13 days of department-owned float to the CPM update schedule." The department-owned float was added to the next CPM schedule update. Here is the contractor's CPM schedule update narrative documenting the addition of department-owned float. And here is the update schedule with the department-owned float added to it. A review of the schedule determined that 10 days were eligible for mitigation of state-caused delays. This was documented in the change order memo under time adjustment as shown here. The change order was executed, processed and approved. The mitigation of delay time that benefited the state was 10 days times $1,700 per day TRO equals $17,000. History of the department-owned float specification. 1925 to 2006 standard specifications, 30 editions. There was no critical path method schedule specification, therefore, no department-owned float specification existed. The 2010, 2015, and 2018 standard specifications read, "The engineer may accrue department-owned float by early review completion of any submittal if the early review completion saves time on the critical path." The 2022 standard specifications reads, "The engineer may use department-owned float to mitigate past, present, or future department delays by offsetting a potential time extension for a change order." Notice there is a change in wording for the 2022 department-owned float specification. In the 2022 edition of the standard specifications, the wording has changed so that it is no longer limited to submittal reviews. 2022 standard specifications. The engineer may use department-owned float to mitigate past, present, or future department delays by offsetting a potential time extension for a change order. What other critical path activities could be used? Eliminated items? Reduced item quantities? Plan changes? Traffic plan staging revisions? How many thousands of dollars in delay mitigation entitlement has been missed out on by Caltrans since 2010? Though it is almost never used, the department-owned float specification is not as mystical and complex as it first appears. The resident engineer and claims unit must merely look ahead for opportunities and be aware when we save time in the schedule. The contractor has entitlement to charge Caltrans TRO for state-caused delays. This specification entitles Caltrans to recoup some of that liability for instances where Caltrans has saved time for the contractor. This is totally fair. Why not start using this specification to assist project funding, reduce G12 and CTC funding requests, and save tax dollars?